Shocked, disgusted, and yet not surprised. That's the response I had after reading a story in the New York Times yesterday. It was about the kitchen culture at Noma, one of the most famous and influential restaurants in the world, based in Copenhagen. The chef, René Redzepi, helped define what people now call new Nordic cuisine. He was known for his fermentation labs, his foraging, and his use of wild and unusual ingredients in his creations. So, when a bombshell story like this comes out about a place like that, it gets attention. It certainly got mine. And I'll be honest, after reading the article, it really affected me. And not because this was anything new to me. I'd spent more than 25 years working in professional kitchens. But because it was an eye-opening reminder about how there's still a part of kitchen culture that allows something like that to happen in the first place. And if you haven't seen the article, let me give you a small sampling of what went on, allegedly, behind the scenes with Chef Redzepi and his staff. One of the incidents described in the article takes place during a busy service. The story claims Redzepi dragged a young sous chef outside in front of the entire staff because the cook had put music on that the chef didn't like. I think it was like techno. Dozens of cooks were made to stand out in the cold outside in a circle surrounding the two men while the chef humiliated the guy, taunting him and punching him in the ribs, until the cook finally shouted something degrading about himself just so everyone could go back inside and finish service. And according to people who were there, that kind of public punishment wasn't a one-off moment. There were other stories too, like intimidation, humiliation, even people being jabbed with like barbecue forks under the counter so guests wouldn't see. Slamming cooks against the wall, punching them in the gut or the chest, and degrading cooks because of small things like leaving tweezer marks on a piece of food while plating was the norm. And while foodies dined in bliss and pure ignorance, the staff were abused to make those plates possible. And I'm not sharing this to sensationalize. I'm not here to conduct a public trial on YouTube or to take the pen out of journalists' hands. That's not what this is about. Now, to be fair, he has admitted that he did bully people and that he's gone to therapy to deal with anger issues. And that's fine, sure. But he hasn't fully been held accountable. And while apologists will say, well, what happened in the past is in the past and he's learned, I don't see it that way. Harm needs amends. And maybe this whole bombshell will be the beginning of that. I can't predict what's to come. But what this really comes down to is that this story is bigger than one restaurant. And that's what brings me here. Kitchens have always run on a certain frequency, if you will. There's a strict hierarchy, the brigade system based off the military. There's enormous pressure and a belief that toughness is the price of admission. And if you survive it, you belong. And if you endured the bullshit and the pain on your way up, there's this almost unspoken expectation that you will then inflict that onto the next set of up-and-comers. It's like generational trauma that you get to bestow upon others like some sort of karmic payback. And this can look anything like screaming at cooks, sometimes humiliating them, making their lives problematic, bullying them, and sometimes even worse. And the strange thing is that many people accept it as simply being part of the job, which is bullshit and is justified with the, well, it's always been done that way kind of mantra. And Redzepi himself shares that in an Instagram story or his Instagram post that came out just a day before the New York Times article. And he claims, and I'm going to read this, "When I first started cooking, I worked in kitchens where shouting, humiliation, and fear were simply part of the culture. I remember standing there as a young cook thinking that if I ever had my own kitchen one day, I would never lead like that. But after we opened Noma and the pressure began to grow, I found myself becoming the kind of chef I once promised myself I never would be." And I remember saying that to myself as well. There were some chefs that I worked for who were absolutely awful. They didn't throw things at me or physically abuse me, but they were terrible leaders. And I learned how not to lead. That was my lesson from them. But there's always a part of your early days that somehow still seeps into your core, like no matter how self-aware you are of it. There's a seed that gets planted, and it's up to us whether, how much we water and nurture that wayward weed or how much we can starve it off. And sometimes it's a struggle deciding where to go. What also stood out to me in this article was the silence. Several people described witnessing these things, these horrible things, the abuse, and then nothing. Nobody talked about it afterwards. It was swept under the rug. And the whole kitchen, just going back to work. And that kind of silence exists in a lot of places. In the case of Noma, people stayed quiet first and foremost because they were afraid of losing opportunities, namely their job right then and there, because that restaurant carried enormous prestige. To speak up would mean essentially getting blacklisted and killing off your own career before it even started. And secondly, people stayed quiet in the face of abuse because the culture of chefs had built this almost like this mythology around itself that made that kind of behavior seem almost inevitable. Even today, as people are speaking out against, Chef Redzepi, they do it under anonymity because even years later, they still fear retribution. The physical abuse may have ended, but the psychological one continues in some way today. For decades, the image of the chef wasn't just someone who cooked food. The chef was the volatile genius, the perfectionist tyrant, the brilliant but difficult artist whose temper was just the price you paid for greatness. And, reality TV leaned into that image. Look at Hell's Kitchen or Top Chef or any of those dramatic kitchen shows. Movies and TV shows often reinforce the stereotype. Books. And it seems at Noma, that tired trope was held as gospel, as canon. And no one felt that they can do anything about it. To this day, some folks, again, defend this type of culture as being the price you pay. That's what you get for having a top-tier restaurant name on your CV. And some people are okay with having their dignity and integrity trampled over so that they can have some culinary clout, I guess. It reminds me of an old joke, cooks used to say, is like, what's the difference between God and a chef? God doesn't think he's a chef. Now, people laughed at that. I used to laugh at that. But like most jokes had a grain of truth in it. That larger-than-life image of the chef gave some people permission to behave in ways that would never be acceptable in other workplaces. And yet seemed completely acceptable in kitchens, no questions asked. And then there was the way, the kitchen culture sometimes talked about itself. Anthony Bourdain famously described the kitchen as a kind of like pirate ship, like a crew of misfits and, drinking and swearing and working brutally hard and living outside normal rules and hours of operation. He was in the band of bad boy chefs, to which there was and still is a certain fraternity around that. And for a lot of emerging cooks, that fraternity feels exciting. It feels rebellious. But that mythology also helped hide some darker things happening beneath the surface. Bourdain himself described the ugly underbelly of the culinary industry as a quote, like a dark and familiar truth, which is exactly how I see it as well. And here's the thing. Even when an abusive or toxic chef departs, they still leave an energetic imprint of some kind. Like, chefs are highly influential and cooks are easily influenced. So sometimes, toxicity often breeds more toxicity unless you break the cycle somehow. Now, for many, in both positive and negative ways, a chef's legacy goes far beyond what they put on the plate. It's how they lead, how they comport themselves, how they speak to others, how they show up, how they model themselves, and so on. And I've worked with fantastic chefs who have mentored me in powerful ways, who showed me how to command respect and give respect, how to be empathetic and still lead, how to teach without humiliation, how to get the best from myself and others while holding a compassionate eye and heart. And luckily for us, there are many, many chefs who lead like that and do incredible work. The idea that you have to be a jerk to be brilliant is nonsense. It's just another tired trope spewed by those who don't want to look at themselves in the mirror and clean their acts up to get rid of the old toxic culture, because for some reason it entices them or it serves them, but it doesn't serve the collective. Now, the good news is that the industry has changed a lot. Over the last 30 years or so, many kitchens have moved towards something healthier. Just the way I described it. The best chefs I know today care deeply about mentorship, about building a strong team, about teaching young cooks instead of trying to break them down. And leadership in kitchens can be demanding without being cruel. Like I said earlier, I didn't get slapped or hit, but I worked with cooks and chefs who were exposed to violence in the workplace on their journeys and paths, either as the aggressor or the victim. I'm talking knives held to necks, attacks in change rooms, slaps on the head in front of everyone, and so on. And we haven't even talked about the verbal dress downs, the humiliation rituals, the countless degrading words misogynist, sexual, racist, homophobic, whatever. It was all there, like a warped buffet spread out, all under the guise of machismo, of toughening up, and enabled by this stupid code of silence. Now, part of that change we're seeing comes from pushing back, challenging the norms, and speaking out. And it takes courage to stand up and say that things aren't good enough. It takes a lot of bravery. And because of that, and people speaking out, I know a few workplaces, some places personally I used to work 16-hour shifts in, that now limit shifts to half that. Kitchens now that do leadership training for sous chefs, chefs, even for cooks. Kitchens where there's a more progressive way of running things and still getting top performance from their teams. But cultures don't change overnight. And sometimes you still see echoes of those old ways of doing things, those old wounds sitting in the center of things, rotten like the pit of an old prune. We'd like to think they're all gone, but clearly there's still some more work to do, but we're on the right path. It is happening. And so reading that story this week reminded me how easily an entire profession can normalize behavior that shouldn't be normal at all. When something exists long enough inside a culture, people stop questioning it until it threatens to boil over. And it has been boiling over. The truth is, great food has never required cruelty. And the best kitchens I've ever been a part of didn't run on fear. They ran on something much simpler: respect. If you found this episode helpful or thought-provoking in any way, then please subscribe. It helps to grow the channel. And I'm curious to hear from you. If you've ever worked in a high-pressure environment, kitchens or anywhere else, did you experience this kind of culture? And do you think things are actually changing? Leave your thoughts in the comments and share this with anyone you might think will find this interesting. And hey, you'll find new videos here every week where I examine culture, identity, and meaning through Gen X eyes. This has been. Thank you. I'll see you next time.